And welcome you very specially to our coverage. This very important coverage of one of the most important budget presentations in the Fourth Republic. This is why. First, this is the budget that's supposed to take us into the election year 2024. This is also the budget that's the very last one of President Akufo-Addo stay in office. Indeed, I'm sure many of you are aware that the Finance Minister shall be presenting the budget on behalf of the President of the Republic of Ghana. And more importantly, for the economy of this republic, this is the budget, which is the first after we went into that seminal IMF program. What will change? What will be the impact of it? We'll be exploring all of these and be hearing from the minister. After that, we will be concluding the conversation. But I've been saying, I'm doing this with a man who understands this area more than I do. Winston Amoy is already in the studios with me. We also have a guest who should be giving us better appreciation of the matters here. Ofori-Atta. He is a partner and in charge of financial advisory at Deloitte Ghana. You're welcome very much so. And joining us from his base in the USA is a former finance minister who's presented this budget before. Indeed, he's presented a budget under an IMF program before. We do recall that in 2015, right?
Yeah.
Going into that 2016 year, and that 2016 year was an election year too. That's also the year we are entering the new, what they call election year, and also having an IMF program because we started in 2015. We'll be getting some insights from him on how important this budget is and what we should be doing differently. Also joining us from the United States of America is Professor William Pepra. He's an associate professor of finance with Andrews University in Michigan. This is supposed to be a very wonderful conversation with you participating in this conversation on our social media handles too. I was trying to put in perspective what you should expect in this conversation. But Winston, I was talking about the seminal nature of this budget reading, mindful of the political environment we are going into and the one we find ourselves in, the socio-economic one and the difficulties that people find themselves in the Republic of Ghana. Then the IMF program we are currently under. Beyond this, how important is today's presentation?
Well, it's important also because we all agree that the economy is not in the best of places. It's not the best shape.
Yeah.
We targeted a growth of 1.5% this year. We targeted inflation of end of year 31%. That in itself will tell you the challenges that we are facing. And so for many businesses, particularly businesses and the Ghanaian citizenry, they want to know what new policies, what new programs are being put in place to ensure that, one, their livelihoods are improved. And we've had this conversation before. You see, because we went into an IMF program that focuses mainly on revenue mobilization, revenue generation, increased revenue generation, a lot of people would want to know the next line of action. Today, the Food and Beverage Association of Ghana has been complaining. Today, AGI has been complaining. Today, GUTA is complaining. So you want to find out, because we know that in the last budget, following the review, we decided to reduce expenditure from 205 billion to 189 billion. You want to find out this time around what it is that we're going to do. Over the period, we've seen consistent increases in our expenditure and also revenue minus COVID. In COVID, we saw an increase in expenditure all the same. So you ask yourself that simple question, what is going to change this time around? For me, what I'm looking out for is the plans that would revitalize the economy. We've talked about this over and over again. I know that we did say post-COVID-19, we talked about coronavirus alleviation and revitalization of the economy. Ghana Cares Obatampa program, enterprise scheme. What has become? We've not seen much 3 years after its presentation. And so for the 2024 budget, as we go into an election year, you want to find out how much government intends to spend. You want to find out what policies and programs government intends to implement to turn the economy around. That is very, very important. Okay? You want to see those programs. But even as we talk about programs that will turn the economy around, you want to see how government intends to, one, generate more revenue without burdening the small number of Ghanaians, the quarter of workers who are paying these taxes. Because we do know that in a country where we say that we have about 88 of the economy being within the informal sector, how many of them contribute to income tax, direct taxes? I'm not interested in the indirect taxes, direct taxes.
I'll come back to you, Winston, and I'm sure throughout this conversation we shall be hearing from the finance minister on how many of these issues you are raised are going to be addressed. That's if he's going to address them. But yeah, I'll also be speaking to you in a second. I need to go to the USA and speak to the former finance minister because he's been here before. In 2015, he had to present a similar budget ahead of the election in 2016. And the pressures that come on you as a minister to make sure that you not only have a budget that's cutting a lot of the expenditure, but in an election year that we have characteristically been spending way beyond our means. What do you expect your successor to do? Which areas are you expecting him to highlight? Mr. Tekpe, you are welcome.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and good morning in Ghana and here to the panelists. Let me put on record that our last budget was read in 2015. We did a media review, and the record shows that we ended the year with, on the new basis, a deficit of 6.1, very close to the 5% in the fiscal responsibility, act. Debt was at 57%. In fact, the rate of debt accumulation, was declining because we had set up the sinking fund and paid about 300 million plus, of the first sovereign bond, which the MPP continued to pay down in 2017, 550 million. And therefore, I'm only saying this to these indicators quickly to state that the phenomenon of expenditure budget has never helped. But it is possible, for Ghana not to bust the budget, especially within an IMF context. That's not to say that IMF is dictating anything to us, but it's important for us to see the program. Because the program is based on a letter of intent, and it is based on a memorandum of understanding, signed by the Minister for Finance and the governor on behalf of government. So that's my first point. My second point is that if you read, this is going to be a budget in the context of an IMF program. It's not new. We know that. We've done 17 IMF programs. The last one was the one that overlapped an election year. We were able to reduce, expenditures. So this notion that you can't reduce expenditures in an election year, remember 2015, crude oil prices fell. March 2016, when Parliament revising the budget, and we scaled down the youth schools and other expenditures that had to be done. We know the confusion that arose in the 2017 budget with respect to the record in 2016, but that has since been corrected. Not on the website, not in data. We've mentioned this to the fund, but that is the truth. We did zero financing of the budget in an election year. That was something we had to do, even though we had agreed to do the 5%, but because we wanted to show, because we had done reforms on the expenditure and the rest. Let me also say that for this budget, I think that Ghana is in a situation which probably marks our first or second of the 17 budgets that we have had. We're going back to 1983 to see a situation, like what, we're facing us now. It's deep. We don't have access to the external markets. Our own domestic market is virtually non-existent. The budget is dependent, on T-bills for financing. Therefore, you have deferral of expenditures. We have pipeline, contracts, about 77 billion. This I'm quoting from official sources. 77 billion Ghana cedis, 53 billion have been paid, about 31 billion has been loaded, particularly from the energy sector, as debt, which is part of the domestic debt exchange, and external debt, which is part of what's been, negotiated. The fund itself has said, the government itself has accepted that we are in a debt situation. I think we should have a medium-term perspective. Because if you read the Memorandum of Understanding again and what has been agreed with government, we are expected to increase revenue over 1 million term, 3 years by 2%. Right? That means that much of the burden of bringing back the the economy, is based on our ability to cut expenditure, our ability to complete the external debt exchange as quickly as possible, get confidence back in the economy, because you cannot depend on treasury bills to continue to depend on treasury bills. A 3-month instrument, sorry, not year, 3-month instrument, to finance particularly your domestic capital budgets, which are based on the, support, your domestic expenditure in a capital budget. So this, I think, is the context. It is the reality, that is facing us as a nation, and it's important. Now, let me just mention, the line items. Raymond, we have over 15 or so levies. About 12, 11 of them, came in the last 7 years. What more tax increases? And when we hear things like, oh, we're going to be removing taxes on inputs, they shouldn't have been there in the first place. Remember when the street levies were created at the National Health Insurance, levy, and the VAT and the GET fund, these were being collected as though they were taxes. The state levies blocked the ability of businesses to claim input tax credit. So we are only making a correction. It is no innovation at all. It's no new innovation in taxation. The principle of VAT is that it is a consumption tax. It's a tax on consumers. And therefore, if registered businesses, pay taxes on their inputs, it should be elevated through the input tax credit or the refund mechanism. This has been blocked, since 2018 or 2019. So we're only doing a correction, serious correction. We must look to the medium term. And the government has published a medium-term revenue strategy, which is a template from the IMF on expenditures. I think that we all know that expenditures are ballooned. This is the only fund program which we have gone into without substantive, and I mentioned substantive, cut in expenditures, right? Now, therefore, if this year we are being told that the government is going to look critically, at expenditures and trim them, it is belated. Remember, we had $6 billion pumped into the economy for COVID, and there should have been no reason whatsoever not to be able to use them to meet some expenditure needs, social intervention as well as others. But we ended up, with a situation in which we are now. Now, these two take us to the deficit. And it's projected that the reduction in deficit is going to be slow. It's not going to be something going into a rush, right? And therefore, the accumulation of debt, our debt is over 100%.
Yes, Mr. Tekpe, forgive me. I need to go back to Parliament. I understand there's activity on the floor. The Speaker of Parliament has taken his seat. He started speaking. So we need to rush to Parliament to see what's happening there. And hopefully we'll get back to you to hear more from you. Yes, certainly we should be able to complete these thoughts of yours after we hear from Parliament. And of course, I see the visuals. If you see on your screen, and they are taking their prayer now and commencement of that sitting, where the finance minister is expected to pretty soon address the people of this republic on budget 2024. This is where you should stay for the very best and the latest of the conversations on this.
To speed the day of the common beauty of Ghana and Africa. Amen. Honorable members, having received any message from His Excellency the President, and I just want to inform members that after the presentation of the budget statement, we want to have an emergency meeting of the Committee on Standing Orders of the House. There's a need for us to look at it. And then tomorrow, the Committee on Selection will meet. There's a need for us to re-engineer the leadership of some of the committees so that we can handle the budget properly within the few weeks at our disposal. This is just an announcement to members because the notice that is required has not been given. That's why I'm taking this opportunity to inform you. So we move to item 4, correction of votes and proceedings and official report. We will start with the votes and proceedings of Tuesday, 14th November 2024. Page 1. Page 2. Page 3.
So busy activity on the floor. The speaker indicating that, yes, we'll be having the budget today. Beyond that, the speaker also telling us about the arrangement post-budget, which requires some re-engineering of some of the committees to ensure that they deal with the provisions of the budget later on. Of course, there's a debate starting on Monday on the budget, and the various committees have to consider the various sections of the budget. Then appropriation is also given the nod before the year ends, before government can spend going into the new year. And that's the indication the speaker was given. Of course, now they are correcting the very minutes that they've had in times past. But let me come in studio. And you just heard Mr. Tekpe taking us back into history from the time he did the very last presentation and moved on. Talk about the very things that surprises me about our current program. And I did hear him Winston say that this is perhaps the first time we've had an IMF program, and yet when it comes to the issue about expenditure rationalization, we appear not to be doing a lot about it. Now, the ISA report of 2022, that is the State of the Ghanaian Economy report, which was recently actually delivered, made a very interesting observation that despite the promised cuts, about 30% in expenditure, we still surpassed the target we had when it comes to expenditure in that particular year's budget. That's 2022. We are in the very last quarter of 2023, which means making sense. We should have the very first 3 quarters available to us. And the indications are that we should be able to understand whether we follow the expenditure patterns there. I was speaking to you, but let me bring Mr. Latte into this conversation. How useful to the ordinary person is whether or not we're able to stay within the expenditure plan? If you're unable to do so, that means you have to find money to plug that hole. How useful is having to live by a strict expenditure plan going forward?
Okay, so thank you very much. As you know, our debt profile has been increasing, and it's part of the reasons why we went to the IMF for support. And our debt profile increased on account of a number of factors. The first one being our issues or challenges in the energy sector. The second one is our rising deficits. So historically, we have a plan that per the Financial Responsibility Act, we are supposed to work within a budget deficit of about 5%.
Okay.
But when COVID struck, we suspended that provision. And so our budget deficit went all the way up to about 12%. We should have been working towards a progressive reduction in the budget deficit, what we call fiscal consolidation. Unfortunately for us, that target, we've missed it consistently. And instead of us working towards a fiscal consolidation, as in reducing the budget deficits, our budget deficit has been increasing year on year. In the revised budget estimate, the mid-year budget, we had proposed to overspend by 50 billion. So the total revenue that we were targeting about 134 billion, and then we were planning to spend about 184 billion. So about 50 billion in excess of what we had proposed. That 50 billion has to be financed by a third party or by some form of borrowing.
Okay.
And that's why we are going through the IMF program, and also we are negotiating with external creditors.
Now, there's an interesting conversation and nobody can leave you out of it. I'll bring Winston into this. But I want you to prepare to tell us, from your very wonderful industry expertise and competence, are we going to get taxes going up? This is a very tough conversation. John Jinapor in Parliament is already hinting that whether we like it or not, we're getting some taxes increased, even if it's not going to be introduction of new taxes. Earlier today, Haruna Adus also brought in the fact that there's possibility of an introduction of an emissions tax and some other ones that are likely to come in. But wasted. Expenditure rationalization is a conversation we have all the time. Yeah. How are we unable to cut our coat according to whichever revenue we have?
Well, Raymond, I mean, you talked about the third quarter. We don't have figures now. The finance minister will present
giving us that,
third quarter figures. But if you look at the first 2 quarters, for instance, so we had budgeted expenditure of 92 billion, but we spent 68 billion.
Yeah.
But that's also because we were expecting to raise about 68 billion of revenue, and we raised 59 billion of revenue. And so the finance minister, when he presented that, talked about how they've been in line. But this is the problem. We know that, look, and part of the reason we have not even spent much in the first quarter was because we had anticipated to pay some 10 billion Ghana cedis as part of our debt payment. I mean, external debt repayment. Interest payment, I beg your pardon, interest payment. Now, we didn't pay that because we know that in December, we said we're going to stop the payment pending the completion of the IMF program. We are still in discussions with them. It's until we complete those discussions, we're not going to go back to pay. Also, when it comes to the payment of even domestic interest, the budget was about 17 billion in the first half of the year. We had paid some 14 billion. Also, we know because of the domestic debt exchange program. So all of that actually gave us some bit of space when it comes to our expenditure. But this is the reason, this is the point. If you have high interest rates, and if you have a lot of external debt, and you have a depreciating Ghana cedi, that's something you must be careful about. Anytime it goes up, it would give you a bit of a problem. We know our compensation also. And we know a lot of our expenditure on goods and services and capital expenditure, which in most of the instances do not even correspond to what we say we're doing. And I'll explain. We know we've talked about the wastages within the system. And so even in 2023, for instance, we indicated we're going to spend 27 billion the whole year. That's our capital expenditure for the year. In 2022, it was 13 billion. And you would ask yourself, as we go through an IMF program, one of the things you would expect is cutting down on expenditure. So why are we looking at increasing capital expenditure? It is important that capital expenditure is increased to be able to stimulate some growth. But you ask yourself...
Because that's for critical infrastructure.
Exactly.
Which is needed for the country to develop anyway.
For the country to develop. But do we need those huge margins, 100% increase in capital expenditure, for instance? I would say, hold on a minute, let's be careful. Hold on a minute. And
would it not depend on what we are using the money for?
Well, while it would depend on what you're using the money for also, you and I, we sat on air and in the period of the IMF program, we stopped advocating the construction of new roads because we felt that at this point in time, what we had to do was to turn the economy around. Okay, so we're having to go with a lot of the things we already had. But I need to look at, for instance, the goods and services budget. It's another area that we should look at. When you look at the goods and services budget, and let me just bring that to you. So goods and services, for instance, the whole year we projected some 8 billion. That's something you look out for all the time. We are talking about, we're going to put a halt on the purchase of new vehicles and all of that. What happened to them? We talked about, the coupons that the ministers and all of that, again, we're going to slash it. What happened to them? We talked about salaries of political appointees going to be reduced. What happened to all of these? The problem you have is that all these things are made, and that's why I like the ASA report. You make these promises, you don't put figures to them. So put figures to them. Let me check the next time and say, okay, you told me this is how much you're going to save. Did you save them? And so if you look at all of these things, the other big problem is that there's too much wastage in the system and a lot of challenges with our procurement. Too much of the wastage goes into procurement. And so in our current dispensation, since that's the area that is juicy, you need to spend more in order to make more for your pockets.
I've not heard any of you, and maybe I'm bringing Professor William Pepper into the conversation. Prof, my guests in studio have not hinted or strayed into the conversation about whether or not we need to increase revenue by implementing some tax increases. Would you be bold enough to support the indications we've heard from the minority or so about possible tax increase? Good morning, you're welcome.
I will not be bold to support that move. Where we find ourselves as a country, it requires us to look at how we are going to cause a behavioral change in the mindset of the citizens to be able to become entrepreneurs and be able to find a way to survive. Let me use the word. Now Ghanaians are only focusing on what they need and not what they want. So what I'm expecting is that this budget should address the need of Ghanaians. And what Ghanaians need now is not any new tax coming in the system, but what Ghanaians need, if government really wants to increase revenue. I'm just going to refer us to, I think Winston was mentioning it, the wastage in the system.
Yeah.
The Auditor General report for 2021 and 2020 alone, if we put the widespread corruption and waste in public sector figure that they came out with, 17.4 billion for 2021, 12.8 billion for 2020, putting the two together gives us 30.2 billion. So if government really wants to raise revenue, we can find a way to raise the revenue by plugging the loopholes that have been identified by the Auditor General. That alone, just looking at this, gives us about 1/3 of our budget for 2023, the revenue that we wanted to generate. So if government is intent to raise additional 12 billion, my best bet is that we must be very, very systematic and strategic in a way to find out the first half of 2024, how are we going to make sure that even if we are going to ask for surcharge, which the laws allow, on this 30.2 billion, do a surcharge and see if we can get some of the money back. If government plans to increase taxes, Ghanaians, I think we are already seeing it. There's tax evasion and tax avoid. Happening in Ghana. Though the government is trying hard on compliance, but to go on that line of bringing out any new taxes will be a major disaster. And remember, the next year is election year, and probably it will not sit well with the government. If you ask me,
how about consolidation and possible increase in current taxes? Not introducing new ones, consolidate and possible increase.
That is what the IMF document requires government to do. And if you look at it very well, by December, that is also, there's a date set which they must also fulfill. So something on the Tax Exemption Act, government may have to work on it and conclude on it. And I'm expecting the minister to give us a figure that in 2024, we will not be going for doing some or stopping some tax exemptions we have granted to some entities in the country to bring in revenue. Now we may have to ask them to pay. That is a consolidation and probably realigning some of the taxes. I think Seth Tekpe was mentioning some of them. I heard also the tax expert mentioning them. Some realignments, probably how we calculate the VAT, which will help industry to have either input and output taxes. That will help. We may also have to be careful because now I heard that wages are going to be increased by 23% first 6 months and then additional 2%. This gives an indication that government does not intend to employ. And the moment you increase wage bill, we will expect government to have a major cut in some line items. Government may have to prove to us where they are going to get the money to pay. Probably they want to satisfy the labor unions. That is why they are agreeing to such increase. It is good for the worker, but it also comes back to the worker or the citizens where government must find ways to raise revenue. This budget is very critical. Will the government be bold to reduce expenditure? I am not very sure that knowing what has happened within the last 2 years, government will be very bold to say they are going to reduce expenditure. Maybe they want things to run as they are running now, and then they hope that through compliance, tax compliance, as they are doing, the VAT payments will increase, and that will probably bring in the 1.4. If not, government will be relying on short-term securities, treasury bill to fund the 2024 budget, which will also come back to hurt us because interest rate may go up a little bit, and it's going to affect the entire system. So this budget, I mean, is tight, but for me to share my last bit on the issues, I'm expecting the minister to come out with a budget that will affect the micro levels of the economy, not the macro levels.
And for those who have no proper appreciation of this, can you clearly tell us what the difference really is?
So the micro level, government must change the mindset of people. So if the government agenda is to create employment with all the programs they are running, we have not seen it being implemented. So the 2024 budget should go into implementation. The Youth Start program. What is government going to do to make sure that it's being implemented? Even if you don't have the 10 billion and you have 1 billion or 2 billion cities, what are you going to use it to touch the youth to get employment? If you are going to focus on agriculture, which type or levels of agriculture is the government going to touch? Is it going to be substantial farming or mechanical farming? These things must be clearly stated in the budget so that we can measure the government and they can have an impact on Ghanaians. Ghanaians need to work. If government really focuses on the macro levels, how we are going to address inflation, interest rate, yes, it's good to focus on that one. But what Ghanaians need now is that they want to work. They want to find a need to survive. Ghanaians need money to survive. That is the most important thing that Ghanaians require now. So that's why I say that this budget must touch the micro levels of economy, changing behavioral mindsets of the Ghanaian to be able to find a way to survive.
I'll come back to you, and please join us in this conversation too. There are social media handles. You should be sharing some of your thoughts. And I know on Facebook, a lot of you also started with your commentary on that end. I should be able to hear your expectations ahead of the minister delivering this 2024 budget. And Professor Pepra just outlined some of the more reasons why this budget should be important to everybody. I was saying that I didn't hear you, and it appears it's only the politicians that have taken the lead in talking about whether or not there will be taxes increased, maintained, or new taxes introduced. Now, our medium-term revenue strategy has some very indications about what's going to happen. In all, Ghana between 2024 next year and 2027 will be hoping to introduce 113 different administrative reforms and also legislative reforms in the taxation space alone and the revenue structuring space alone. The idea is to meet the same target of 20% tax to GDP, but the very different ones. And I'll come to the direct and indirect taxes and what we are telling people we will do. And as to whether the reality in today's budget reading will reflect what our medium-term revenue strategy is supposed to be. But from where you sit, are we going to have taxes increased or new taxes introduced or current taxes reduced?
Okay, so I'll put the conversation broadly in terms of the concerns that we solicited.
Because you don't want to share what you have heard from the grapevine with us.
Arising from concerns that we got from business leaders in our pre-budget stakeholder engagement. So there are about 4 or 5 key concerns. The first one is increasing the tax burden on businesses and individuals. So we seen instances where the PAYE, that's employment taxes, from 25%, 30%, 35%. Now we've got corporate tax. Our current corporate tax is 25%. It compares well with Algeria and Ivory Coast. But Kenya and Nigeria have got 30% corporate tax. So if the minister is trying to be bold, he will just say that, look, go, your neighbors have got 30%. Why are you 25%? Let's do 30%. So it's likely that we will fall on increasing existing taxes. So the rate on them will increase. So one of them is the corporate tax, which I said is 25%, 30%. We also have reintroduction of taxes that were...
The corporate tax, is it
it's 25%, 25%. Right? And then it's likely to go 30% because our peers, Nigeria and Kenya, are 30%. So it's possible. I'm not saying that.
There was a reason why we kept it at 25%, or even reduced it when they proposed previously to not actually increase it. That reason was that we needed to stimulate some growth in the economy and do more production. Is it not so?
It is not the case that when you reduce taxes, you exert compliance. And that's something that it's a fundamental principle. So you can reduce your tax rate from 25% to 5%. That does not necessarily mean that the people who were not paying will start paying. Because our tax structure and our system is such that the faithful few, we call them, are the ones paying all the time. So you will still be taxing the same pool at 5% instead of taxing the same pool at 25%. So if you broaden the tax net, then reducing the rates.
The other side of that is that the faithful few could also
be tired.
And they could begin to have more liabilities than expected. And so if, say, it was 20 or 15%, there would not be the need to actually engage in a bit of avoidance. But if it is at 30, then you draw their attention to how about we play along? How about we also make sure that we avoid a few taxes that we can avoid so we don't pay more? You would not disagree with that?
Yeah, so I think the point clearly is that what taxes are we implementing? How are we going about them? So for generally, the principle of taxation is efficiency in collection and efficiency in application. So how many people are paying the taxes? How can we get a lot more people into the tax bracket? Which is why for taxation, there are 3 ways that you implement them. You first enforce existing laws. We've talked about property taxes and all. How many of us have paid our property taxes this year? Next year, you talk about the same thing. So we are not enforcing the existing laws. Yeah. Secondly, you amend existing laws. So we are saying corporate tax 20%, 25%. It may go to 30%. It's an amendment of an existing law. VAT was 12.5%. It went 15%. It's an amendment of existing law. Introduction of new taxes. That's the last part that businesses are not interested in. Because when you do that, you create a lot of uncertainty. Businesses are budgeting for 2024. And they are budgeting with the current rates. Now you are introducing new e-levy, you are introducing corporate tax. There will be a new tax that will be introduced, pollution, sanitation. It creates a lot of uncertainty. So businesses are worried about that.
So in your forum, were the business more amenable to pay increased, say, corporate tax?
They are interested in the first 2, which is first enforce existing taxes.
Okay.
Bring more people into the tax brackets. You can't be taxing the faithful few and keep taxing them. They get tired, like you rightly said.
Yeah.
Secondly, if you want to do anything at all, you amend existing laws. Or the taxes that were abolished on account of maybe e-levy coming, like road tolls and all, you drive through, the road we are using has deteriorated. You want it to improve, yet you are not paying taxes on them. So reintroduction of taxes that have been there, and not introduction of new taxes that really affect our business. And I can give you a very good example. Our corporate tax rate is 25%, but effectively some institutions are paying 35%. Because financial institutions over and above the 25% are paying growth and sustainability. They are paying previously what we call national reconstruction levy. They are paying financial sector recovery levy. If you put the composite of that together, financial institutions are paying about 35% in Ghana. So we have to look at how our tax structures are and reform them. VAT at 15%, and yet we have other levies that you cannot claim. And those increases the cost. So we are doing what we call tax on tax. Businesses are concerned about indirect taxes especially, and they want a revision of the tax and the way we are applying the VAT system. Why? Because when you increase VAT and other indirect taxes, you are also affecting inflation. Today, inflation has dropped from 38% in the previous month to now 35%. That is a remarkable progress. But if you want to see that downward trend, we have to avoid the introduction of indirect taxes because those taxes will be passed on to the consumer, which will then increase inflation.
Now, I need to bring to your attention these. In the medium-term revenue strategy, These are policy reforms that government is seeking to do in the indirect tax area, which you just mentioned. It says here, align excise duty rates such that similar products attract the same rates. The second one is align the exemption and relief provisions in the customs tariff with the VAT Act. Review the VAT registration threshold requirement. Review VAT exemption on the supply of residential properties. Review VAT associated levies on taxable supplies to allow input deductibility of the levies. Review VAT exemptions to make them more efficient and less distortionary. And review the headline rate of communications services tax. Complete harmonization on the rate of excise duty on tobacco products with WHO recommendations and ECOWA protocols. There are 3 more. Review excise tax regime and introduce a hybrid tax, that's into brackets, ad valorem, and also specific taxes on spirits, wines, sugar sweetened products, and beers, adjusting for inflation periodically. Expand the excise tax regimes to cover other products like selected cosmetics, weapons, and ammunition. There's the develop an automatic adjustment formula for the rates of the special petroleum tax, energy sector levies, and excise duties. And the last one on the indirect tax rate is reduce reliance on wage-based taxes and shift focus to consumption-based taxes. This is what government says we have agreed to do between 2024 and 2027. Do these things generally suggest a possible increase in the taxation regime we have now?
So the list that you've mentioned, you can classify them in 2 broad terms. So the first one is the exemption regime.
Yeah.
We have to review our tax exemption regime. So we provided exemption to some industries historically because we were expecting investors to put money there. Yeah. Today, we have found those investors. There is no need for you to continue to keep those exemption regime. The problem we have with our taxes in Ghana is that we introduce taxes with sunset clauses, but the sun never set on those clauses. And COVID. You are still paying for COVID. You have COVID. So those sunset provisions must be enforced. So our exemption regime has to be reviewed, and it has to be reviewed to make them comply with the current operations. So for instance, we're still granting exemptions to industries like the oil and gas, mining, etc. Our mining sector and oil and gas sector has developed, it has matured. There are new sectors. A very good example is renewable energy. You have a client who is trying to do a renewable energy, and then there are import duties on all the panels, solar panels that they are importing and all the things that they need to build the solar plant. And then we ask for exemption. The argument there is that, look, some of the products they were importing, for instance, there was alcohol there. The argument of the revenue authority is that they have other uses. So until you prove to me that when you import that alcohol, it will go straight to the solar plants, I will not give you that exemption. Okay. So that's why we have to review. So that when you review it, it makes it compliant to the industry where the person importing that alcohol, it is tagged in such a way that that person cannot take it to the shop or the blue kiosk, but he will take it straight to the misapply. So that review is there. And then the other thing is where we have a distortion in application of our taxes. So today you have the VAT you pay and you have other levies. Those other levies you cannot claim. We have what we call input and output VAT. If you pay VAT of 15% on the goods that you have bought, and then you are also charging someone 15%, at the end of the month, you have to do a netting off. The taxes you have paid, the VAT you have paid, is let's say 100 million. You have also charged somebody 80 million. You are supposed to pay, or you are supposed to be refunded 20 million. That's the difference. But the levies that we have, the COVID levy, list all of them. You can't claim them under this regime. So what it means is that if I'm a businessman, those levies are passed on to the consumer.
I see. Now, I want to bring you, Winston. See, this is a government that came in with a promise to cut taxes. Yes. That came in with a promise. And in the first budget, remember, 15 were either removed, rationalized, or some way taken off. In fact, they were called, there's a term they use for it. Nuisance taxes. How come we are at a point where our conversation is tilting towards increase, it be the margins or increasing the taxes or introducing new ones? How come we have come to the position where a government that believes in the golden age of business, strengthening the private sector, appears to be suffocating that private sector with more taxes?
It's very simple. So, I mean, the government came into office thinking about the fact that, and Yaris talked about that already, okay, if we do this, it's going to lead to an increase in tax. Well, there may be some truth in there, but you'd have to also ensure compliance. It's one of the areas we failed in. And so merely saying we want to move from taxation to production will come with taxation, that's a fact, because once you produce, you'd have to...
you have to be paid.
You're earning it. But the problem is that in a country where 88% of the economy is informal, you ask yourself, how is government ensuring compliance?
Yeah.
So because we're unable to ensure compliance, because a lot of people were not paying their income taxes, now we looked at the indirect taxes and said, that's the way to go. Because if we can't get people, so if you have your payee, you pay at the end of every month. At the end of the month, Deloitte would look at all their earnings and, every quarter they go and make payment. CIT, they go and make their payment. Others will do same, we'll do same here too. But are others doing same? No, they're not doing same. And so if others are not doing same, how is the government expected to raise necessary revenue? Government will then begin to look out for indirect taxes. In that case, all of us, once you're purchasing, you're paying. And that's why you've seen VAT go up. And that's why you've seen, Get Fund and NHI becoming straight levies. And that also in itself adds a bit of, margins to what you're paying. And so we tell you, it's 2.5, and then 15%. But if you were to do the computation, you're looking at about 21.3%. So any government that focuses so much, Raymond, on indirect taxes is telling you that they have a challenge ensuring compliance in the payment of direct taxes. And that's our reality. And that's where we are. And as the reason today, I've been doing some checks. I'm told that going into the budget, we're likely to see, I say likely because some things can change as I talk to you right now, once the finance minister, but we're likely to see some new taxes. Already, I'm sure you may have been hearing about the emission taxes or whatever. I don't know how they're going to put it. I don't know, the whole thing that would be behind that. But I hear there's going to be something like that. I've had, the member of parliament, some even from the majority side, beginning to make a reference to it, as the minority also makes reference to it. The tax stamps that we've been talking about, I hear the conversations about increasing it. I don't know what that's going to be the situation, but that's what I've heard. But what I do know... But
hold on, the medium-term revenue strategy, we mentioned tax stamp, says here we review the Stamp Duty Act to bring it in line with current economic trends. It also mentions that we enhance taxation of income from rents, we would improve the management and administration of withholding taxes, and include the Commissioner General's authorized VAT invoice as evidence of a deductible expense for income tax purposes. They also said they are going to review the concessionary corporate income tax rates and implement a progressive personal income system on taxable supplies to allow inputs deductible on the levies we are talking about. There's another one. We also say we are going to deal with the redesign of the electronic transfer levy. This is a levy anyway, and for enhanced revenue mobilization and administrative efficiency.
And you've seen, so you can actually relate that to the conversation that is actually going on. And so when I talk about the tax, that's something that may happen. You've seen, the withholding tax, you've seen it on, betting and gaming, sector, for instance. They've introduced a 10% on the withdrawals. And so that's also in line. It was actually something that the finance minister talked about even in the 2023 media budget review. But look, this is it.
Anyway, you mentioned gaming. I just need to add in that government medium-term revenue implement the taxation on gross gaming revenue on industry players and the withholding tax on winnings. So those who are hopeful that after a lot of what they complain, that it will finally be scrapped, or it doesn't appear to be the case, because our long-term plan is to keep it.
Yeah, so there's been a challenge with actually the stakes and everything. And that's why they've gone for the withdrawal.
Okay, yeah.
So they say once you withdraw, because there's been a lot of issues with the winnings and everything. So they say once you're trying to withdraw, then you take the 10% withholding, permanent. This is not something that you can claim. It's permanent. And so that's the situation in there. But remember, this is the point. See, this is the point. Professor Pepra makes the point that Ghanaians are now talking about what they need and not what they want.
Yeah.
And so when the people begin to talk about what they need and not what they want, it means that they don't want, it means that they just need the basic things.
Yeah.
Because they understand the times that they find themselves in. And if you understand the times that you find yourself in, and that's why we've always made the point that I disagree that that our IMF program was based on revenue mobilization. I would have also expected a corresponding expenditure rationalization in this case, cuts. Because if we go on that tangent, look, if we want to engage in revenue mobilization, unfortunately for us, compliance and enforcement is something we never do in this country. So we always look for increased taxes or introduce new taxes. That's what we always do.
Are they not easier to implement?
Yeah, but you must do the right thing. You see, that's why you're voted into office. That's why you have a team to manage the economy. I am saying that it is not my responsibility to collect taxes. And I've made this point before. If government gave monies to over 100,000 businesses under COVID-19 cap bars, how many of them have paid income tax after the end of the moratorium period, 2022 to 2023? How many of them?
Okay, I need to bring in Prof. Prepare to this conversation. Prof, the conversation should head in one direction, and I want you to lead in this direction for me. To the market woman today, to the unemployed youth today, to the business person who's been complaining about high taxes and why they are actually driving them out of and they getting to sack people from their jobs. Should they expect relief from this budget, or is it close to impossible to expect relief from this budget by way of the inflation that we see, the high cost of goods that we are having in fact, in the last few years or so, basically the goods that we have seen, they are really going up when it comes to prices. Should we expect relief for Ghanaian people, for businesses, and for the general economy from this budget reading?
So I'm going to give one example, but probably two. The first one is the COVID-19 levy. If you remember what the finance minister said when this levy was being introduced, it was to help pay for the free water and electricity that Ghanaians used. And I remember correctly, he said it brought a hole and then it needed to be filled. So that tax was a temporary tax. So, and I have seen a document, the finance minister, they have one of the IMF documents stating that they use about $1 billion, which they use some of the money to pay for the water and free water that they granted to Ghanaians and food. So I think that if the market woman or any citizen in Ghana will be happy to hear today that the COVID-19 levy, which came in as a measure to solve a problem, has been taken out, and it's going to reduce, which is captured in the how we pay, become like part of the VAT returns. It's going to bring a reduction in prices, and the market to whoever is in the market will benefit from it. The second one probably that needs to be reviewed is the electronic levy, the e-levy. It may even help the government to score a political point because it really came at a time that we all saw that the debate was very, very, very high. So these two, in my opinion, may point to a direction that, the government is trying to do something about the taxes.
If I could press you further on the e-levy specifically, we have reviewed the rates from 1.5 to 1%. Which other form of review will be reasonable and will be optimal at this instance?
So in my view, if the government changes the process that instead of the sender making the payment, the telcos will have to make the payment. So that 1% should come from the revenue that the telcos are generating. So it becomes free to the one who is sending the money. So in that case, that is what I'm saying, that people will be very happy that you move it from the one sending the money back to the operator of the electronic levy. Let it be part of the cost build up or a tax charge to the telco, but not to the one sending the money. And in that case, I mean, you remember, MTN even showed some good faith when government announced it, that they even, well, I think they came out with a plan, and later I know how it happened. So if government can say the telcos you have to pay, and then it's going to score a political point, because this particular tax is really it has affected the entire strategy and system.
Okay.
And one political point, I'm speaking as just looking at it, is going to affirm, I mean, the elected presidential candidate, the vice president strategy, that he doesn't support taxation on electronic levy. So this is an opportunity for the government to review it and change it and come out with another strategy. If I were to be the finance minister and looking at the situation, these two will be something that I will take them out in the system. In terms of the COVID levy, the minister may have the option to probably change the name or find a way to readjust it onto something else, but just remove the name COVID levy as well. I mean, it's caused a political point.
I get your point. Maybe I'll come in studio because he drew down to, because the question I was asking is, should I expect relief? Is it reasonable for me to expect that this budget is going to solve the bread and butter issues? Is it reasonable for me to expect prices driving down big time? You know, there was some time ago that even petroleum prices were part of the budget somehow. But should we expect specific programs, policies, be it monetary or fiscal, that are directed at making sure that Ghanaians can do business, make profits so that government can actually tax it? That ordinary things like food and also are seen within very reasonable bounds that people can buy. That kenke, which used to be 1 cedi a couple of years ago, would come down to 1 or 2 cedi and no longer remain at 5 cedi, which is why we buy it in Domain, for example. So are these very small things that affect everybody a reasonable expectation from the budget? What's the first?
Look, Raymond, I do not think that's something you would get in the budget. Ordinarily, you should expect to see that. But this is the point. We did planting for food and jobs.
Yeah.
Planting for food and jobs was actually to deal with a high cost of food. At a point, we were priding ourselves as having exported maize to our neighboring countries. That's a staple in this country. Now, watch this critically. If we had implemented the planting for food and jobs properly, would have gone about it this way, would have identified few farmers, giving them assistance. They cultivate huge lands, tracts of land, and are able to feed the country. What we did was to target a lot of farmers. And one of the things we do because of the politics, so we look at, 200,000 people have benefited from this. This is the other point. Because we're looking at a lot of indirect taxation, and because we're looking at businesses having to pass on, now that person who sells food, her only source of revenue is the foods that she sells. So if she has to pay a lot for all other things, don't expect that person to also reduce the food that she sells. One of the things...
Even though I may not track any other tax increments on the very things she's using in the cooking of the food anyway.
See, that's what we forget. What we forget all the time is that this is... Let's make it very simple. Because I've had to sit down with people, and I told you the last time on the SMS, somebody who was actually selling fufu. Because if she sells fufu, she gives you soup. The soup that she gives you, she's not selling the soup to you. She's selling the meat and the fish to you. But how does she prepare the soup? She prepares the soup using her tomatoes, onions and everything, spices and everything, which may be very expensive.
Mindful of tomatoes' contribution to inflation.
Over 58%. So if that person has to spend all of that, what she's going to do is that she's actually going to reduce, the size of the meat to actually take care of the soup, or she's going to increase the cost of the meat to take care of the soup, because that's the only way that she is also going to make a living. And so if we want to really make things work, and I've said this before and I'd repeat it, look, all the taxes we've collected on imported items into this country, how much of those taxes have been directed specifically to import substitution on the very things that we are taxing them?
That's interesting.
Yes. Let's ask ourselves this question. Because we say that, the long-term plan is to be able to produce these things.
Be self-sufficient
in rice production. The import duties on rice, how much of it goes into the support of Ghanaian farmers to be able to produce rice?
So that we can replace them.
And then we can tax those people later on. Somebody should bring me the figures. How much of it? We put it in a pool, spend, come around and tell us that, we collected these import duties. But I know the ministry may have it. They may have it because then they can identify, this amount we collected. How much of it has gone into supporting this one? So this is the point. So long as we continue to actually increase indirect taxes, people will find ways because they are also paying. And that is just to make the point that Professor Prepra makes. If you ask the telcos to pay the levy, they will pass it on to the people. They will never absorb it. They will pass it on. So the service charge that is now 0.75% will be increased by 1%. They will give by 1%, take it to 1.75%. So if we're talking about the bread and butter issues, we must have targeted plans. And that's why I agree with Professor when he talks about the micro, your individual economy. If we're able to improve it, but it also stems from the macro anyway, okay? If we're able to improve that. And so if, for instance, today, and one of the things he talked about, which I agree with him, if we do not check those things, okay, if we don't check a lot of the indirect taxes, it would go into increasing the rate of inflation. Why? Because if I pay more, I will pass it on to whatever I sell. It's as simple as that. If I am struggling, if you walk up to me and I'm an MC, both of us something we do, let me use that as an example. If you walk up to me today, if I'm going to charge you, I would look at my conditions also and say, if I can get this amount of money, why wouldn't I get it? And that's the way to go. If we don't deal with that, the cycle will continue. We will turn around and say, because we want to arrest inflation, we would increase policy rate. It makes it very difficult for people to produce. And once it makes it very difficult for them to produce, even if they go and borrow, so if the cost of money is very high, what they will do is that they will transfer it. Businesses are not Father Christmas. They will transfer. There are some times that they may want to look at their profit margins and reduce it a little bit. But over the long period.
But there's even a limit to what you can transfer to me.
Exactly.
If I can't buy your product again, what will be the point?
But this is the point. If they are not able to transfer everything to you, they might as well think about laying off workers. So they begin to cut their cost. And if they cut their cost, they are also going to increase the unemployment rate. And as a government, you don't want that because it will also affect even your own revenue generation. Look.
And your political popularity.
Look, we have a lot on our hands. But until we begin to do targeted things, I want us to start the conversation. If we're taxing rice, how much of it goes into supporting rice farmers so that we can be self-sufficient in rice? If we're taxing, sugar, how much of it goes into local sugar production? None. Let's have that conversation and begin to be serious about import substitution and not paying lip service.
There is, in his book, John Beatty makes the point that for every country, two things are very key: inflation and exchange rates. And he says, because these things affect not only business, but ordinary people in ways that actually they care about. So they may not care about your major issues in the country, on how you're running the country, but the price of food and other materials they use in their homes, the prices of accessing transportation are very important to them. Is it unrealistic for the ordinary Ghanaian to hope that a budget being read today for 2024 would address these sharp rises that have been happening on the front of food and other materials that people use at home? Is it unrealistic?
Yeah, so I think we have to think through it in a very simple way. I recall in the days of the term of John Kufuor, there was a lot of emphasis about macroeconomic indicators. Yes. Then Osafo will come and talk about the inflation going down. And I heard one of the statements that was being made by the opposition at the time was inflation yebedi, exchange rate yeberi. And it's a similar thing or similar sentiment we hear from the people on the streets. What they forget is that how much you are paying for your gobe, how much you are paying for any of the products you buy, is a function of the depreciation of local currency. Because inputs by farmers, fertilizers, are imported.
Okay.
And before
not the beans itself.
That's the thing. Okay. So the cost, inflation figure that was published yesterday, you'll be surprised that Greater Accra region has the lowest non-food inflation. Greater Accra, it's also at the medium in terms of food inflation. But the highest inflation were recorded in northern Ghana. Bronga half northeast. Bronga half, these are places where they are growing the food. How come they have the highest form of food inflation? It's because the cost of input is increasing. And the cost of input is a function of your inflation or your depreciation of the local currency. So as the local currency depreciates, cost of fertilizers go up, cost of machinery. Do you produce machetes here? Do you produce tractors here in Ghana? The cost of all these inputs are increasing. So the food inflation will go up. So the ordinary person should not see
that a higher cedi, a higher dollar rate affects the gobe that we are eating.
Ordinarily, because the food that's on your table is a function of partly imported product and domestic. And the things you are producing here is produced with inputs that are imported. So essentially, about 80% of what you have on your table that you are eating is related to things that have been imported.
So is it reasonable for me to say, I don't care about which economics you do, Mr. Minister, I want to pay less for gobe? Is it reasonable for me to say that?
That's a very good question you've asked. So when you go through IMF programs, they always make room for what we call social protection programs. So there will be emphasis on things like livelihood empowerment programs. There will be emphasis on programs that support, let's say, Development Bank of Ghana, where assets to credit will be made available to farmers, institutions, smallholder farmers, associations, trade groups. These are programs that are available not only to the IMF program, but even international donor agencies and foundations like the MasterCard Foundation. They have programs that are supposed to support those who are marginalized in society and all. So I expect government to take advantage of some of these provisions where they introduce specific social protection policies. When you introduce National Health Insurance Scheme, it was one of the best schemes ever to be introduced. And we took advantage of those who were working to use their social security contribution to take care of the poor who cannot pay for the health. It's the same thing if you introduce such initiatives, such innovative measures.
It's interesting you said when we introduced. It is to presume, or there's an inherent presumption that the status of that policy has changed one way or the other.
But, I mean, the problem with the scheme is the funding.
Okay.
And that's been an age-old problem. If we have structured the funding right, it would have been such a sustainable program, like you're saying. So the same thing...
The other point you are making, you have moved to not just NHIS, you have moved to other policies.
Other social protection. So social protection programs are programs that are aimed at the poor and marginalized. So not all of us will be affected directly by the introduction of taxes.
Okay.
The man sitting in the village who just wakes up one morning and he eats gari and he sleeps, thinking about the next gari to eat, it's not affected by taxation. So such people are affected by the social protection program that we introduce. And we should be very innovative in introducing such protection programs. And those protection programs will get funded from external sources. When we introduced school feeding, it was funded by Danida, that's the Danish agency. Yeah. So if we introduce such programs, some of the programs we introduce, we end up politicizing them as opposed to allowing them to run independently and then get independent funding. If we don't structure things like free SHS rights, school feeding rights, they become unsustainable. So all the social protection programs that we are introducing in this budget, we should have a funding structure to make them sustainable beyond the government, the current government. So successive governments will come and they will still keep those social protection programs.
I may not be needing a social protection program. I may not be within the bracket that's required for safety net programs. But I am worried about why I'm paying so much for my drugs. And compared to a couple of years ago, from just around 100 cedi to 400 cedi now. Do I also have a reasonable expectation that this budget will put in place structures and measures that will make it easier for, if I'm not reverting to the a little over 100 cedi, somewhere in between that should be reasonable for me? Is that also a good expectation?
Yeah, so I think it's an expectation that will not be met in the short term, I would say. It's in the long or short to medium to longer term.
When you say short term, what do you mean? As in, I should not expect it next month or the next, as in the first few months of the year.
It won't happen almost immediately, as if in the era of when we had budget rate and the price of milk, sardines, and are mentioned as part of the budget. No.
Should I expect it next year?
You should expect in the course of the year, when you see a progressive improvement in the local currencies rate.
This is despite that economic principle that there is rigid downward movement of prices. I should still expect that if I was paying 120 or so for that drug, now that is over 400 cedi, with prudent measures being put in place, possibly being announced in this budget, I should be paying less than what I'm paying now. Is it? That's what I'm talking about.
To be fair, let's face some of the things. So let's say a basket of tomatoes, some few months ago, let's say 250. It's not the same today. So you have instance where the 250 basket of tomato is now selling for 150.
Yeah.
So that happens. So it means that when certain factors are put in place, certain policies are put in place, let's say those who are importing pharmaceutical products, if you give them tax exemption, which is why I'm saying that the tax exemption regime should be reviewed. Who are we giving the exemption to? Are they helping to protect people who are marginalized? Those who are diabetes, those who are suffering from kidney disease and all. The product that we are importing to take care of them, if we take off the taxes from them, kidney or dialysis treatment will be cheaper.
Okay, so that direct impacts of this sort. And
excellent.
I mean, West, I'm asking this because sometimes our conversations are wonderful and interesting, but people sit home and ask themselves that if I'm still going to be paying more come January to December next year, what really is the essence of all of the macro and policies you put in place?
Because your personal inflation is always different.
Okay.
Okay.
Your basket is different from yes.
Yeah,
your personal inflation is different. And the way you're going to calculate your inflation may be different from how, it's always different from how the state calculates inflation. The state's calculation of inflation is totally different. And that's why, something that has gone up so much has only a weight of 0.2. 0.2, sometimes 0.01. It means that in the scheme of things, its computation, the value that it has is very little, very minimum. So it doesn't really make a lot of impact. Okay, and we know, for instance, that sometimes the prices of goods and services have gone up way higher than the rate of inflation. But that's national statistics, national figures. That's why it's an average. But this is the point, Raymond. When your currency depreciates, and you're a country that relies so much on imports, that's the problem you would face. The pharmaceutical companies import a lot of their raw materials into this country. If they have to buy them in dollars, bring them into this country, pay taxes on them, they would have no choice but to get you to pay for them. Okay? Somebody just sent me a message and said, I want to expand my hospital.
Okay.
I have imported machines into the country. They're not manufactured in Ghana. If I have to pay taxes on them, now watch this, that person pays taxes on them. When he comes to fix them, what is going to happen? He has to now, and Yawenko would help him, get the cost of it, spread it over the years, and tell himself how much he must raise every year to take care of the cost of the machine. That person clearly is going to charge you more when you go because he's had to pay more for it. And this is the other part. I mean, you talk about the rigidity of reduction of things. This is the other point. There are times that I can actually look at it and say, look, I cannot pass everything on to you. So I would absorb part of it as my losses, hoping that if it goes down, I won't reduce it immediately. And you saw it when it happened. When the cedi started appreciating and there were calls on Guta, they said, hold on. Because when the things went up, we did not pass all of it to you.
Yeah.
So now that it is beginning to go down, we must also try and make a bit of profit. In the midst of all of these things, I think that after the budget going forward, one day we should look at particularly pricing in the informal sector.
Okay.
It's something I've been looking into, and that's something we should do because it has a lot of issues there.
And the fact is that, Prof, I need to, because of the urgency and the relevance of this taxation regime, not long ago, the Food and Beverages Association put out a list, and I'll go through some of the food products, of tax-inclusive and tax-exclusive prices of sample products. Evaporated milk, without tax, is supposed, that's for a tin, supposed to be 8 cedi 50 pesos. With taxes, it goes up to 15.5 cedis. Spaghetti, 1.9 cedi without taxes. With taxes, we are looking at 4 cedi. When it comes to juice, 38 cedi without taxes. But when we add the taxes to it, it's 70 cedi. That's a box of juice. Tin tomatoes, 7 cedi when there's no tax on it. But when we add these taxes to it, we are talking about 13 cedis. Cement, a bag, 58 cedi without the taxes. But when the taxes are added to it, we are talking about 90 cedis. Then we move on to beer per bottle, 5 cedi without the taxes. It's 11 cedi when you actually add the taxes to it, and that's more than 100% anyway. Perfumed rice, 50 kg. It's supposed to be 410 cedi when there's no tax on it. But when we add all the taxes, we're talking about 770 cedi. Non-perfumed rice, 300 cedi when there's no tax on it for 50 kg. Then it moves up to 650 cedi, and that's more than 100% when you actually add the taxes to it. 50 for a bag of 50 kg. That's sugar, right? 490 cedi when there's no tax on it. It moves up to 930 cedi with the taxes on it. Chicken, the imported one, per kilogram. 23 cedi when there's no tax on an imported chicken. When you then add the taxes, we're talking about 40 cedi. Then the local one, of course, I mean, it's also there. The cooking oil, a box, 170 cedi without taxes. It moves up to 375 cedi when you add the taxes to it. Even what you use in cooking the food, for example, a used gas cooker is 900 cedi when we import it into the country without the taxes. But when you add the taxes, we are looking at 1,700 cedi. Sardine box, 220 cedi. Then when you add the taxes, it's 460 cedi, more than 100% too. When we move out to the food, most of you have cars in the Republic of Ghana, and it's because we have a very terrible transportation system. Car battery, wasted. 600 cedis should be the cost when there's no tax on the car battery. When you add the taxes, we are talking about 1,200 cedi.
100%.
100%. Yeah. Prof, are these taxes justified, reasonable taxes and levies, mindful of the jump in some of the products that are so essential in the lives that we live today?
I would say that the growth or the rate of growth in the taxes over the years, especially after COVID, has been so astronomical. And I understand, remember what the minister said during that time, that they needed to increase revenue. He made that argument, as he was mentioning, that if you compare Ghana to our peers, our tax to GDP was around 13%, and they needed to find a way to bring it up. So straight away increase the various taxes. So in my view, the government just looked out for an easy way to apply these higher tax rates on the imported items, or whether all these items, to be able to raise revenue. And in effect, it is the main reason why we saw inflation going up. Not only the exchange rate, though the exchange rate was a major factor, but the taxes also brought in a higher increase in the inflation rates. And as everyone who is a trader will also find a way to add their margins onto it. So tax rates in Ghana, fairly, they are high. The only issue that we have been discussing is how do we expand the tax, the net, to bring in more people to pay. And only the few who are paying, and because government will find it very easy to use import tax or other indirect taxes to raise revenue. That's why government is going on that approach. But if government should expand the tax nets and get all of us, especially, let me also speak to Ghanaians, we all try to pay taxes, even in a small way. It's going to really help the economy. I give an example. I have some artisans working on my project in Ghana, and sometimes the amount of money they charge for labor, I ask myself, are these guys going to pay taxes? I am not sure, because we don't have a mechanism to get these guys to pay. But can we find a proper way or ask them, these artisans, we register them and ask them to pay something small to government? And in a way to bring them in. That is the only way we'll find a way to reduce the tax burden. Probably government also being too lazy, let me put it in that way. So they think that this is the way to go. Let's increase the existing taxes. If it gets to a point, people cannot pay, and we will see the smuggling issue coming up again, as it was in the 80s and early 90s, where goods were smuggled in from other countries into Ghana. When you have your tax rate on products too expensive, make your product too expensive, it encourages smuggle. So it's something that probably we may have to also watch. We need to find a way to, in economics, we call it the Levine curve. The taxes should be set in a way that it encourages people to pay, but not to put people away from paying their taxes. Let me address one issue. I heard someone in the parliament mentioning that there is a hint of pollution tax.
Emissions tax. That's really what they target. Yeah.
So the question is that tax coming to solve a problem? Who is going to pay? Are they going to charge it to the manufacturing sector already that is crippling in Ghana, or the extractive industry? And the question is, how are companies going to measure the emission rates or causing in Ghana? So we talk about
fundamentally, Doc, fundamentally, as a country that's committed to the very policy resolutions that we all went to sign at the last conference of parties, the climate change conference, are we not bound to reduce emissions in the country? And it's one way of reducing the emissions, not asking the people who are generating these carbon prints to be the ones directly paying for them, so that they will reduce it, or so that we take the money and invest in areas like adaptation and mitigation, which will help us progress as a state. It's not right.
So, my understanding is that we got some money from outside.
Yeah.
Because we are positive in terms of the net of Ghana was green.
Yeah.
And was helping the system.
Yes, our carbon print from our national communication suggests we are on the right path, but strengthening that.
So who is the government going to tax?
As in, who should be paying the emission taxes? It's not the people who do the emissions.
Well, Remo, let me just say that, if announced, I'm sure the minister would go back to Parliament with how he intends to collect.
That's true.
And who's going to pay.
But we are talking about the general rationale for...
Yeah, general rationale, yes.
Weston, let me see. It's the same way we did with the COVID tax. There is a problem, then we came out with a tax for the problem. You want to encourage people to move their manufacturing into your country, and you'll be the first country in West Africa to come out with this tax. You are going to get all your big manufacturing companies moving away from Ghana. I tell you, in my life in Ghana, around 2007 thereabout, there was a company close by me. I was in manufacturing sector. There was a company just close by me behind Tor, the Moy refinery. There was a policy about fishery, and they closed down and moved to Ivory Coast.
Oh, I see.
So we have to be careful if we are going to tackle the mining sector, because let me put it, the extractive industry, because they come out with some carbons in the system. You have to be careful, because they are going to, as I've mentioned, this budget should come out with a behavioral change. That kind of behavioral change should be positive. It should not be negative.
But it's a polluter pay policy, not a progressive one.
Let me tell you, if you ask me, if I were the finance minister, I will come out with Galamsey tax. and not emission tax.
But Galamsey is illegal, right?
They say they have made it illegal for some people.
Small scale mining, rather, it's legal.
The small scale mining.
Yes, Galamsey is the opposite of it, yeah.
The small scale mining guys, they should be paying more taxes.
Okay.
Because they are rather destroying the environment.
No, I get your point.
Ourselves, we are able to work with the new malts, the big guys, but the small ones, we are not. And they hide behind politics, political entities, party affiliations, and they destroy and they go. It's
27 minutes past midday. The expectation is that the finance minister would have been in Parliament delivering the State of the Ghanaian, the budget 2024. Of course, State of the Economy will be the first part of that particular budget, apart from giving us the international outlook. We understand Parliament's been suspended for a couple of minutes. The finance minister, we understand, is not yet in Parliament. The Parliament is taking a break, rather, for a couple of minutes. That's about 10 minutes or so. We should be going to Parliament to hear what's the hold-up for. That's if the expectation that he would have done it earlier was a realistic one. And give you updates on what's really happening on the floor of Parliament as the MPs dialogue on the way forward as to how they are going to be hearing and what exactly is going to be the content of Budget 2024. But we shall stay with you here as we prepare to hear perhaps one of the most important budgets in the Republic of Ghana. Winston is with me in studio. You just heard Professor Andrews, of course, Professor William Pepra there. Early on, you heard the former finance minister giving us his thought on what's supposed to be expected in this budget, sector specifically. And Jaulate is a partner with financial advisory competence at Deloitte Ghana. And we'll be having a conversation about what you should expect in the budget, what it means for you, and what's likely to be like going into the new year, especially when we are just getting into the mainstream of our IMF program. Second review, and we're expecting some other amount of money from the IMF too. When it shall come is also another matter that we shall be delving into in the nearest future in our conversation. So after the break, we'll continue with our conversation here in the studio.